Welcome to EPG Pathshala. I am Shormila Mujumdar, Associate Professor, Department of English, University of Kalyani, West Bengal. This is your module on the selected poems of Sylvia Plath. Now, before we go into the biographical details of Plath and her literary work, we will like to talk about something which was profoundly important for the readers to understand Plath's poetry. You know, during the 1950s and 60s, there was a tradition of writing of what later came to be described as confessional poetry in American literature. Now, what is confessional poetry? You know, what does the word confession means? It means that you admit to something which is otherwise considered to be extremely personal or something about which you are secretive, something which is not readily talked about in the society, details and secrets which you don't very commonly, ordinarily, readily share with other people. And in Christianity, confession has got a religious connotation because there is this system, or there is a confession box attached to the churches, and when people are overridden with a sense of guilt, they go up to the confession box. There is a priest to whom they confess to their sins, believing thereby they get rid of their not only overloaded conscience but also the repercussions of their sins. This is what confessional poetry is all about. Reacting to the established intellectual and academic poetry, a new form of poetic expression took shape in Sylvia Plath, and she carried the same to England. Poets who were involved in the development and propagation of the same came to be known as confessional poets. This group was headed by Robert Lowell and Theodore Roethke. The most prominent theme of the confessional poetry was to glorify the personal and the private, to express their innermost secrets aloud for all to hear. Now you see, Robert Lowell was a teacher of Sylvia Plath in Smith's College, and it was Emil Rosenthal who first used the term confession when he was reviewing Robert Lowell's life studies. Sylvia Plath was born on 27th October 1932 in Boston and died on February 11, 1963. She studied at Smith's College and Newham College at the University of Cambridge. Actually, she came to Cambridge on a Fulbright scholarship. She was married to fellow poet Ted Hughes from 1956 until they separated in September 1962. She committed suicide by carbon monoxide poisoning in 1963 after suffering severe bouts of depressions and 2 failed attempts at suicide. So you see, psychological problem has been a constant companion of Sylvia Plath throughout her life. She is supposed to have attempted, maybe inadvertently, her first attempt at suicide at the age of 10, and subsequently he tried it, and most of the time of her very short life, she underwent some kind of psychiatric treatment, rehabilitation, and she was acutely conscious of her suicidal tendencies. Plath is best known for her collections of poems, the Colossus, published in 1960, Ariel, posthumously published in 1965, Crossing the Water 1971, Winter Trees 1971, and the last 2 anthologies were annotated, edited and introduced by Ted Hughes, her husband. When she was in her 3rd year of college, where she excelled in academics, she was offered the much coveted post of summer guest editor of Mademoiselle magazine in 1955. She was awarded the Pulitzer Prize posthumously in 1982. She is the first person to win the Pulitzer posthumously. She had, according to Ted Hughes, an unfinished novel often referred to as Double Exposure at her death, which however has remained untraced since. She won all prizes for creative writing at her college. She had written just one novel called Belzar. She had also published a number of prose collections, including Letters Home, Correspondence 1950-1963, published in 1975, Johnny Panic and the Bible of Dreams, short stories, prose and diary excerpts, published in 1977, again posthumously, the Journals of Sylvia Plath, 1982. She also wrote children's books like The Bedrock, published in 1976, the It Doesn't Matter Suit, 1996, Collected Children's Stories, 2001, Mrs. Cherry's Kitchen, 2001. The title of her iconic poem Colossus was changed as many as 8 times. So you see, she was a brilliant student. She also excelled as a painter. She came to study in Cambridge as a Fulbright scholar. But these bouts of depression that she suffered throughout her life actually shaped her poetic career. Most of the poems are either inspired by the theme of her obsession with committing suicide or her very difficult love-hate relationship with her father. Her father was a German migrant and her mother was also of German descent. So Plath was of German descent and she lived through the Second World War, and she was witness to German Jews leaving Germany to come over to seek political asylum in America, and she was very disturbed by the Holocaust, and all these things come again and again into her poetry. The major themes of her poem are invariably death and her relationship with her father. In the theme of death, she talks more frequently of suicides. On another hand, while she talks about her relationship with her father, she was ambivalent at best and derisive of her father at worst. And you know, her father, Otto Plath, was an entomologist who taught at the University of Harvard, and he was a man who did not speak English very well. So you see, there was a gulf between the world that the father inhabited and the world that the daughter inhabited. One was English speaking, the other was not. Since her father died when she was 8, she perhaps thought him to be a deserter, as all children who lose their parents think of their respective parents. Yet, according to many critics, in that very age, children considers their parents to be gods. Plath was no different, and from the many poems that we have read, including Colossus, we find evidence of the same confused adulation, a reworking of confused adoration of the boy in the short story Araby by James Joyce. She often wrote in a relationship of memory and desire, where desire and its resultant defeat led to anguish and anxiety. Anxiety often thickened her depression. Her poems, being personal in nature, actually that is what confessional poetry is all about, reveals her struggle with her depressions. Her poems are documents of the polemic divisions between her eros, life drive, and thanatos, death drive. Though Plath is primarily known as a poet, she also wrote a novel. It was first published in England by Heinemann on 14 January 1963 under the pseudonym that Plath had chosen, Victoria Lucas. For some early critics, Sylvia Plath's 1963 novel, The Bell Jar, was best thought of as a poet's notebook or as a poet's novel, a casebook almost in stanzas. More recent commentators have seen it as more than mere apprentice work for the later poetry. Elizabeth Woodsell comments its remarkable achievement and describes it as very funny, smartly detached, and often nasty in a voice too honest to be unsympathetic. While Robin Peel notes its wonderfully modern humor, Plath is reported as referring to the book as a potboiler. Initially, it was titled the book Diary of a Suicide or The Girl in the Mirror. It was first published under Plath's own name in 1967. It is usually regarded as a roman à clef, which means a novel with a key or novel about real life. Now, what is meant by novel with a key? What do you do with a key? You unlock doors and you get to see things which you have not seen before. So, a novel with a key means that there is a novel where you can find real life characters presented as characters in the novel. That is what is meant by novel with a key. The novel describes the struggle of Esther Greenwood against her mental illness. In the novel, we see a near portrait of Plath, the only difference being that the novel ends on a positive note. So you see, Plath was writing this novel during the last phase of her life when she was suffering from severe bouts of depression. And in a way, this novel is autobiographical because probably it was also cathartic for her because she was trying to deal with her own mental illness. There are several prose collections. Johnny Panic and the Bible of Dreams. The stories and sketches now collected as Johnny Panic and the Bible of Dreams were assembled into successive and rather different editions by Hughes. The collection was first published in the UK by Faber and Faber in 1977. A revised edition with an additional 9 stories followed 2 years later. Johnny Panic also includes fragments and sketches from Plath's journals, which were not at that time available in the unabridged form. Johnny Panic comprises work ranging across the whole of Plath's writing life and spanning her time in England and the USA. The next book is Letters Home and Journals. Since according to Aurelia Plath is Sylvia Plath's mother, the novel was considered as a cruel satire on those Plath herself loved. Commentators have called the 1975 publication of Letters Home, edited by Aurelia Plath, a corrective or an antidote to the Belzer. Letters Home provokes questions about the relationship between private experience and its public representation and between truth and its revelation. Reading Letters Home for an insight into Plath's writing practice is then a potentially problematic approach. Nevertheless, many of these letters reveal something about Plath's careful scrutiny of the editorial preferences and target audience of her chosen journals and magazines. So you see, here you come to something which directly contradicts the discourse of confessional poetry, because confessional poetry is supposed to be, as one critic used a metaphor, raw, as opposed to the polished version of the earlier kind of poetry which is cooked. So if confessional poetry is raw, then all the thoughts, experiences, ideas should come out of the mind of the poet as they are conceived, without any garnishing, without any change. But here in the letters, home and journals, you can find what her mother claimed, that it was a cruel satire on the people that Plath loved, and some critics even believed that there are many letters which say something about Plath's scrutiny of editorial preferences and target audiences for her journals and magazines, which means she was being selective, which means she was shifting through the material, which means that she in a way, if not physically, if not literally, she edited some of these things. Then we come to the poem or the anthology called Ariel. There is an eponymous poem. The poem was written on October 27, 1962, shortly before Plath's death. It was published posthumously in the eponymous collection in 1965. Now, what does this word eponymous mean? It means the same name. So, the collection is also called Ariel, and there is one particular poem, one single poem, which is called Ariel. So, the book Ariel is an eponymous collection of the poem Ariel. The title is perhaps based on the horse which Plath used for her morning ride. It has been understood after the testimony of Ted Hughes as a reaction to her falling off and getting hurt from her horse on one of her early morning rides. However, the poem can be interpreted in a more general context. Of course, we could draw a parallel with the spirit with the same name in Shakespeare's Tempest. On one level, the theme of the poem deals with that of a dawn. On another level, it could mean not just the birth of a new day, but a resurrection of one's soul. The author seems to undergo a struggle which is reflected in the slow progress of the day from the dark of the night. The tone is quite subjective, which colors the expression thoroughly. As the theme suggests, a tussle between faith and doubt, the tone too shifts from hope to despair and back. The next poem is Colossus. The poem was first published in the anthology of the same name in 1960. So you can see this is also an eponymous poem. It contained another 44 poems. The title makes us remember the famous lines from Shakespeare's Julius Caesar. Why, man, he doth bestride the narrow world like a Colossus. The reference could be made to legendary bronze statue of Apollo at Rhodes. The theme of the poem is her mourning for her father. She compares her father with a huge statue, a remnant of a fallen god. So you see, there is her tendency to portray her father as larger than life, because probably in the imagination of an 8-year-old child, her father was larger than life. She never had the occasion to interact with her father as an adult. In fact, it is not the loss of the body of her father that matters to her, but the loss of the psychological security. She tries to recover her lost security by trying to tend to the fallen statue. The tone of the poem is that of loss and mourning. The tone is also that of surprised grief. The poet is surprised at the enormity of the absence in front of her, whose presence as a ghost nevertheless fails to tease her. So you see, this has been a recurrent theme in her other poems as well. The haunting presence of her dead father, as if he is very much there, and sometimes she gets so desperate as to want to kill the ghost of her father. So, loss of security for a child at the death of a father whom she has portrayed as larger than life, and the realization that it is an enormous loss with which she has to cope with, and sometimes the despair to which she is driven when she wants to murder the ghost of her father. The next poem is Daddy, and the name is self-explanatory. As you can see, it's about her father, and there are several other issues which come up in the course of the poem. Daddy was written on October 12, 1962, shortly before her death, and published posthumously in Ariel in 1965. So you can see something that in the month of September 1962, her husband Ted Hughes left her for another woman, and she committed suicide in February 1963. So there was barely 5 months. During this period, she wrote like a maniac. Most of her major works were written during this very short span of 5 months. Though most of Plath's poetry centers around her loss of her father and her relationship with him, this poem perhaps is the most explicit. When we deal with Plath, we often involve ourselves with the psychological aspects of her relationship with her father and other father figures. The title, however, seems rather too romantic and childlike for any dry psychological introspection. Now, you see, you cannot really describe Plath's relationship with her father as being a manifestation of Electra complex. You know what an Electra complex is? The affinity a daughter feels for her father. Likewise, there is another complex which is called the Oedipus complex, which refers to a boy's affinity to her mother. So, cross-gender affinity of children to their parents. The theme, as the title already suggests, is a song about a father. Like any good piece of literature, it too has numerous levels of interpretations. However, commensurate with the general theme of her poetry, it too deals with her relationship with her father. However, as the poem progresses, it gets itself mixed with the memories or nuances of the Holocaust. Now, you know what the Holocaust is. During the Second World War, Nazi Germany, led by Hitler, sent hundreds and thousands of Jews to concentration camps and killed them brutally. This is referred to as the Holocaust, and Holocaust is a permanent scar in the memory of the Jews, and probably the blackest chapter in the history of Europe. Neither in America nor in Britain was the Holocaust directly felt. However, Plath's father, Otto Plath, was born in Grabow, Poland, and perhaps had faced some of the Nazi atrocities, though he lived there till his 16th birthday only. And if you remember your history, many of the Jews left Germany to escape into Poland, and probably Otto Plath was also one of them. And so he had some experience of Nazi oppression, but he was lucky enough to leave Poland after her 16th birthday and come to America. The next poem is Lady Lazarus. Now, do you know who Lazarus is? Lazarus is a man who was brought back from the dead by Christ. And so Lazarus is an enormously wise person, because none of us knows what happens after death. Lazarus is the only person who knows what happens after death, and interestingly comes back to talk about her post-mortem experience. So Lazarus is somebody who is exceptional in his knowledge of life in general, because he knows both life and death, and he comes back to talk about her experiences after death. And we have a similar character in Indian Upanishad who is called Nachiketa, and Nachiketa also died and came back to life to tell his experience. In this intensely self-dramatizing poem, she wrote shortly before her own suicide in February 1963, Plath adopted highly strained metaphors to describe her psychic state. Lady Lazarus, written in the fall of 1962, begins with a comparison between the poem's speaker and the Jews tortured and killed in Second World War. A sort of walking miracle, my skin, bright as a Nazi lampshade, my right foot, a paperweight, my face, a featureless fine Jew linen. Plath pushes beyond poetic convention in her choice of metaphors, assaulting the reader's sensibilities with the lurid violence of her images. And you see, this is a feature of confessional poetry, because not only it talks about something which is entirely private, it also talks about things which are considered to be unpalatable for the consumption of public, and which is supposed to assault the finer senses of the reading public. But all these things are brought into poetry by the confessional poets, and that is what Plath is doing here. And if you know the Indian poet Kamala Das, also described as a confessional poet, wrote about things which are not generally talked about in public, about a woman's menstruation, pregnancy, her sexual desire. And there is another American poet, Anne Sexton, with whom Plath was very friendly, who also suffered from psychological depression, bouts of suicidal tendencies, who was actually put into an asylum and wrote poems about her experiences in the asylum. All of them, they bring into poetry what was hitherto considered to be unworthy of being treated in a poem. As John Rosenblatt notes, Plath's comparison of the sufferings of her speaker to the sadistic medical experiments on the Jews by Nazi doctors and the Nazis' use of their victims' bodies in the production of lampshades and other objects is intended not to make realistic historical comparisons, but to draw the reader into the center of personality and its characteristic mental processes. The next poem is Porda. As you can very well see, this is a Hindi word which Plath adopted for the title of her poem. The poem was published posthumously in the anthology Winter Trees in 1971. However, according to Ted Hughes, this particular poem was meant to be published in the anthology Ariel. After all, it was dated by Plath as 29th October 1962. As with other poems, this one too celebrates the many layers of meanings present in the text. Thus, it has many themes, one of the most prominent being the communication of servitude of women, while the Porda being the means of perpetuating the servitude. And here you can see there is some feminist content in the poem as well, how the personal space of a woman is circumscribed by a porda. A porda becomes symbolic of our confinement, of our limited space, of our lack of opportunity to realize herself. However, the theme of fighting back is also there, since after the 11th stanza, the porda-clad woman turns into the lioness. The tone initially matching the theme conveys the helplessness which with the progress of the poem turns into anger and hope. So you can see the tension. On the one hand, there is anger. On the other hand, there is hope. And that is exactly the situation of women in a society. They are rebellious, sometimes they can strike out a path for themselves, sometimes they can't, so they are angry, sometimes they realize their hopes, and sometimes they despair. Here are certain famous lines from various of Plath's poems. I lean to you, numb as a fossil, tell me I am here. What did my fingers did before they held him? What did my heart do with its love? All we find are altars in decay and profane words scrawled back across the sun. Love is a shadow. I am terrified by this dark thing that sleeps in me. And you can see these are clear references to her own psychological problem, her fears, her anxieties, her despair at not being able to deal with her depression. I am vertical, but I would rather be horizontal. So, in conclusion, we may say Though Sylvia Plath's life concluded rather abruptly, her legacy through heart-wrenching lines shall live forever. Her style was simple and, like all simple things, forceful. Her poems often describe the bouts of depression she went through, which have actually become a voice of resistance against any kind of oppression. She is particularly known for her pro-feminist stance. Yet she has been accepted in all movements as a canonical poet. She often forms the voice of the sad and yet resurgent feminine mind that, though droops under awe, but like Ariel rises out of the crisis like Lady Lazarus and break the poddas constructed by daddies of self-centered patriarchs. So you can see Sylvia Plath has been a woman variously tortured within her own soul. She was a tortured soul, but she tried to negotiate with this in her poetry, and she was a feminist. She protested against all kinds of oppressions, and you can see that for her, the daddy represents a patriarchal system which oppresses women, and so her negotiation with daddy is not always a sense of loss, nostalgia, and hankering to get back the daddy in her life. It is also an attitude of anger, protest, contestation, and finally an attempt to dismantle the patriarchy that the daddy represents. Thank you.